So I'll welcome everybody to the part 4 in the final session of advancing our understanding of the Arctic atmosphere. Thank you everybody so far, and to our next speakers for joining this session. We're going to be starting with Roshan Kaman from at Columbia University, and this is an invited talk with 30 minutes. I'll have my camera off, and then at the 25-minute mark, I'll turn my camera on. Take it away, Roshan.
Great. Can I just share over you, or do you have to unshare?
I think you can just share over.
Yeah, you should be able to. It's set that way.
Okay. Okay. Does that show up?
Yes.
We have full screen. Wonderful.
Great.
Okay. So I'm going to hide the floating controls, but if anybody needs me, just yell. So I'm taking this from a hotel room, so apologies. Hopefully the internet holds long enough. I'm Roshan Kaman. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia University and tied in with the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which is our research lab just outside of the city. And today I'm going to speak about some of the work we've been doing on the atmospheric impact of carbon fluxes from Arctic ecosystems on local and regional scales. And this is work that Luke Schifferl, who's a postdoc both with me and now split between Columbia and Harvard universities, and then Luda Ludwig, who's a graduate student in my group. So why do we care about carbon? What's the focus on carbon in the Arctic? So there are vast stores of carbon stored in permafrost soils. The figure on the right here is a schematic of where the continuous, discontinuous, and sporadic permafrost are, going from the darker colors out along. So a lot of Siberia's perennially frozen soils. Now, historically, the Arctic was a very strong carbon sink, and a lot of these soils are extremely rich in carbon. So the high carbon content means that almost 50%, it's been estimated that about 50% of below ground carbon is actually contained within these soils. Now, that means that if you were to take all of that carbon and put it in the atmosphere, you would be adding 700 ppm of CO2 to the atmosphere, which is almost twice what we have now. Now, we do not expect that to happen, but it gives you an idea of the scale and the potential of things we're starting to worry about. So questions we've been asking are how ecosystems will respond to the rapid warming that we're seeing in the Arctic. The Arctic's warming at twice the rate of the global average. So what does that mean now, and what will it mean for future ecosystem response to some of these very strong warming temperatures? So this is a picture of Luda in Siberia. So this is against a face that should be permafrost, but is rapidly thawing. And as the permafrost thaws, it can decompose and microbes start eating things up, if you like, to produce CO2 and methane. So you can have a pretty strong release of both carbon gases. Now, permafrost can thaw gradually, or it can thaw abruptly. It can change the vegetation or hydrology. It can be on small or large scales. So on the left side here, you can just about see the trees, and you've got a massive thermokarst here. But also you can have little puddles where you get a lot of things begin to thaw, and you get very small scale features where you've got your mosses on this side, and then you're looking at the permafrost thaw as it's happening. So first, we're going to talk about quantifying local Arctic carbon fluxes. So this is a Sentinel-2 graphic where we're looking at Alaska, and then we're looking at Southwest Alaska, and we're focusing in particular on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So the Yukon up here, the Kuskokwim River here, and this is the YK Delta in between. And there's a fairly reasonably drier patch of it that is upland peat plateau. So looking at some of this area here, you can see very different things. So even in this dry area, about 25% of the surface is water, which is the blue areas here. But you can also see what look like darker green and then almost black areas. And each of those are fire scars that happened at different times. So the 2015 fire, you can see here in the very dark colors, but older fires are also visible in the darker green that they cause. The rest then are lichen. So Luda was taking data from, sorry, I'll go back here. So there's a lot of different focus regions in here for different projects. And the NSF program Polaris has been a summer research program where students go out every summer and take a lot of different samples of different kinds of things. And Luda was one of the advisors on that program for quite a while. And using a lot of the data collected from that, she was able to use the aquatic CO2 and methane quantifications, the PCO2, P-methane, and a machine learning model to try and predict, to understand what was predicting the CO2 and the methane in the burned and unburned watersheds for each of the aquatic. And the paper came out recently, so I'd recommend looking at it there because some of it's quite interesting. We don't really have a good aquatic model for CO2 and methane. I'm coming from the more terrestrial side. The aquatic has been quite a surprise for me that it is not as advanced as I thought it would be. And even figuring out what's driving some of these fluxes, what's driving the concentration in the water is actually not that well known. So here she's finding that the water body area versus perimeter, so how complex a shape does the water body have, really controls how much CO2 is in an unburned water aquatic area. Whereas when it's more burned, you're looking at a lot more how much dissolved oxygen is in that. Now, the distinctions between those are actually kind of important. We can scale what we can see. So things like physical parameters of water body shape and area, we can scale that. We can't scale the chemistry. So dissolved organic matter, how much, what DOC, DIC, all that kind of stuff. The chemistry we can't really scale. So if we want to start scaling things, we can probably do a fairly decent job for the CO2. We're going to not do as well for the methane. And that was surprising that there's so much else going on that was different between the two of those. And Luda's looking into a lot more of how much of it can we scale and how can we test what we're doing if we try to scale these different types of fluxes across a larger region at the moment. Now, if we want to look at a bigger region, instead of looking at the YK where work is ongoing, I figured we'd move to the North Slope of Alaska, where we have a lot more longer term eddy flux sites. And we have coastal wetland, which is very wet down towards to the north. And then to the south, we have this more inland upland tundra. So if we're looking at it as water content, there's a lot of standing water closer to the coast, and yet there isn't as much standing water to the south. A lot of it is contained within the soils, caught up by the permafrost layer. So it is in the soils, but it's not visible from the surface. Now, the North Slope of Alaska is probably the most instrumented tundra ecosystems in the world. We have 4 different eddy flux sites to the north, some right around Utqiagvik, Barrow area here, and then Atkasuk here. And then we're down to the upland sites where we have 3 of them at Tulik Lake that are within sight of each other, looking at the bottom of a hill up the side, and then Ivatuk, which is another site further west. So Luke took a lot of that eddy flux data, and we were trying to come up with a way of properly scaling. If we have the CO2 fluxes across the different sites, how do we scale that in a way that makes sense and that we can evaluate it? So Luke came up with a model called the Vegetation Photosynthesis and Respiration Model, VPRM. And I was working with Nina Luce and John Lane on a polar version of that. And then Luke has taken it further again and tweaked it even more for tundra ecosystems. So it's a very simple model when you have the drivers in the right form, but it takes gridded meteorological products for light, heat, things like solar-induced fluorescence for productivity, and there's a bunch of different sources of that, and then tunes that against what we're seeing for the net CO2 flux at the eddy flux towers. Now, that it needs to be done for every version of these that we can find. So if we're using ERA 5 air temperatures, we get a parameter that is tied to the ERA 5 air temperatures. You work it through and you get a CO2 flux calculated from that. That means that Luke came up with 288 different versions of what the CO2 could be on the North Slope. Now, which of them is correct? So if we look at it here, looking at the different CO2 fluxes calculated from the model, it kind of fell into 2 different groups of ecosystems. So we've got the inland upland tundra and the lowland coastal tundra. And you could use the parameters from each to almost interchangeably. So all of the sites closer to the north, you can exchange those light response curves and it works quite well, but to the south, you can exchange those too. We also looked at different land cover maps. So we have different, the circumarctic vegetation maps. We have raster versions of that. We have the NASA Above program, which is the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, uses a land cover map driven by Landsat 30 meter. So all these different maps give us different ways to look at this. But what we really want to know is not what is the mean of all of these maps. What we really want to know is what is the right answer? We're getting 200 plus versions of what the CO2 could be. It gives us an idea of the uncertainty, but which one's right? Is there a way for us to tell if some of them are just completely wrong? We might never know what is correct, but can we rule some of them out? So given that this is kind of a scaling method to calculate the regional carbon flux, which of the eddy flux sites is also the most representative of the region if we're using them to scale is another question that we worry about. And we have a lot of airborne CO2 and methane data, concentration data in the Arctic over the past number of years. So we're going to look at the NASA CARF project, looked at 2012 to 15, didn't get a huge number of flights over the North Slope. The DOE, Department of Energy ACME campaign in 2015 got a lot of data over the North Slope, as did the NASA Above program for their Arctic Cap flights in 2017. So we're going to focus on 15 and 17 for what we're trying to evaluate here. Now, when we see a concentration in the atmosphere, it is driven by a number of things. We have the air coming in from the background, we have a surface influence, and we have the fluxes. Now, I'm going to walk through each of these, and hopefully that makes a lot more sense than me just saying this for contribution to the fluxes. So the flux here, so this is just a map equivalent to what Luke had created for a given hour of time. You've got your everywhere has a CO2 flux. We have how much does the air sit around above these different areas and ingest this flux, if you like. So that's known as our surface influence. Where did the air sit around our area of influence? And then we also need to know what's in the air for CO2 for long-lived gases. We have to worry about how much CO2 and methane is in the air getting pushed into our region of interest. So we look at the enhancement above that background, and then we look at the influence of the fluxes having with the air sitting around above them. And then we compare those two to understand what's going on. So I'll start with the surface influence. And we're using a polar variant of WRF, which is the weather research and forecasting model, with a Lagrangian transport model. So we take receptors, we send them back along the wind fields. Now, I often explain this as if we're looking at an eddy flux tower, you're looking at the very large, the very small scale fluxes and movement of air directly in front of the tower. For what we're looking at here, we're calculating a footprint, but we mean a much larger scale footprint. So we're sending little particles, 500 of them, back in time and nudging them along through the winds. And then we calculate how long does the air stay in the boundary layer directly above our area of interest. And we can then say, well, we're going to expect to see this much of an enhancement, so a ppm enhancement for a micromole of CO2 flux into that air. So it ends up being a very simple calculation as long as we can get it all the way through to something we can actually use. So we end up with this kind of map here where this can be gridded to anything where we have our ERA 5 grid boxes. This is just ½ degree, but we can do it in many different ways, depending on what we're trying to do with it. So that was our surface influence, and we have our fluxes. What are we doing for regional backgrounds? Now we're looking for what is coming in, and we want to know what the change is on top of that. So this is an example of what the interhemispheric gradient of CO2 and methane look like. This is from the NASA ATOM flight campaign this is May of 2018. So between just after the above flights. So this is a slice of the CO2 down the Pacific. So this is data from as far north as we could go all the way down to New Zealand. And what you see here is it goes up with altitude and across from North Pole to South Pole. This is the CO2, and then on the right is the methane. And you can see that there's a very distinct, southern hemisphere is nice and clean. There's a bit of an increase in the tropics, but really we're seeing the highest numbers much further to the north. Now, about 90% of the CO2 you see in the Arctic by May time is air that has the CO2 that was emitted in the mid latitudes and got pushed north into the Arctic. And in this case, it would have been coming from China, so somewhere to the southwest, getting pushed up north. American emissions end up going around Greenland. European emissions go along Siberia, so up and to the east. So this is our CO2 that we're looking at. Same for the methane. So we see an accumulation in the Arctic as the air gets pushed up there, but that isn't necessarily driven by fluxes in the Arctic. So if we want to do that, we have to look at, okay, well, what kind of signal are we seeing? Now we have a long-term NOAA tower right on the tip. It's called the Barrow Tower. It's right in Reykjavik. So here at the very top of the North Slope, and that sees a lot of Arctic Ocean air. So we see that air coming in. We then look at that as our background Arctic Ocean air. We look at the aircraft data. Given what we see in the boundary layer versus what we see above that, can we calculate what enhancement we're seeing as a function of altitude? And we take some uncertainty from that. We allow for some changes to be able to get the numbers that we're talking about here. So that gives us our observed enhancement in CO2 or methane. I have CO2 here, it's the same thing for methane. So now that we have all this, we can calculate what is driving the concentration, but I would also say that we can change the question to which model best represents our regional CO2 fluxes, given that we have the three different components of this. So if we take our CO2, for example, now this is the June to September 2015. On the left side, we have our influence function multiplied by the flux that we think should be there. So we get a nice big stretch out of what the CO2 is. And on the x-axis, we have the observed increase in CO2. So we have some uncertainty on that as well. And there's some uncertainty there, but much smaller. And what we're seeing is that you see the most depleted CO2, so the most uptake from the models and in the observations for July time period down here. And then we see less and less uptake until we're seeing emission as you go towards October, September time. For the summertime, most of the models actually do a pretty good job. Now, if we extend that to look at the Arctic Cap flights, which went all the way into November, we see that there are times when it really doesn't do well. So here we're seeing that the November flights don't do great, and April doesn't do very well either. Generally over the summer, some of the models do better than others. And the bars we're seeing is the 288 different versions. Now, some don't do a good job. So let's start picking and choosing which version of the models best represent what we're seeing in the atmosphere. So we look at the Barrow data. So the NOAA tall tower, we look at the land sector of that air. So air that's spent time over the North Slope, we select for that. Again, taking our background from the Arctic Ocean influence. And we see that for some of the winter, we do pretty well. A lot of the model options are way too high in the very deep winter, and yet very few of them get enough to explain what we see in September, October. Now that time period is the early winter freeze up, and it's very underestimating how much respiration is happening. So during that zero curtain, what we call the zero curtain period, you end up with your permafrost layer at the bottom. You end up with heat coming from the top in the summer, but in the winter, you have this freezing front. So you end up with a layer of warm enough to produce methane, respire CO2 right in that layer in the middle. And then that eventually freezes through. But these days, it is taking 100 days for the full zero curtain period to end. So the soils to fully freeze through, it's now taking months. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here. We're seeing much more CO2, yet our temperature response curves for the soils are not capturing that. So we're not, the way we're parameterizing it from our eddy flux towers is not capturing all these enhancements in the CO2. Now, in order to get match the numbers correctly, we have to include an additional flux during the zero curtain period. And we also need to start taking the aquatic CO2 fluxes into account. Now, taking the same numbers that Luda saw in the YK as a first cut, because we don't really have a lot to work with. So we're finding that our missing CO2 flux in early winter, we're having to include it, we're having to increase the CO2 to get to here to match the observation. So the big black line here is what best matches the atmospheric observations, the airborne observations. but there are different things on here. So the pink is what we would get if we use the best version of the model, but without this additional flux. And then we've got two other ones here. The red one is Nina Luce and I worked on a version of this, and we were just wrong. We didn't have enough overwinter data to constrain the model properly from January up to April, and we way overestimated how much CO2 would probably be coming out. Now we ran out of data to constrain things in about December, January. So I think we were right early on, but we just let it run too much. And the same with Sue Natali's work. Yet Jennifer Watt's new model, her 2019 paper, they were too high. I think they were also too high, but the 2021, we're all starting to converge on there's not a lot happening in the January to April time. And Luke's work is currently in review for this. Now that was the CO2, and that was one region. I wanted to pivot a little and talk a bit more about the methane side of things. So if we're looking at the atmospheric methane, if you're looking at it from the top down, so taking an even bigger scale discussion of bottom up and top down, a lot of global methane models will assume that wetland methane is the only possible natural biogenic source of methane. So is that the right assumption to make? They have no other options because they don't have many other fluxes they could be including. But let's evaluate that for the Arctic ecosystems. So here we have our north slope, which is the areas here. The crosses are the eddy flux towers. One interior, I'm actually going to skip that for time today, but the Northwest Canada. So we've got a wet inundated forest here, and we've got a dry upland tundra here. And here on the right, you can see the inundation data sets that are constraining a lot of these wetland models. So this is the wet boreal forest, and the methane numbers come from Oliver Sonnentag's eddy flux towers in Scotty Creek. And you can see that there's a lot of variability in the methane. This is multiple years thrown together. It's our first cut for it. But there's a lot of variability in what the models think should be happening in this area for this time periods. So 2013 to 16. And the green and the blue are different, slightly different setups for the global carbon project. So this is 13 different global models of wetland methane. And the diagnostic is if they're let loose on their own, they get one number. Prognostic, I can't remember which way around, but some of them are constrained by the wetland model and others are not. And that's the big difference that we're seeing with these. Another series of models was the wet chart, which is the orange one as well. And you can see there's a lot of variability. Now, do we take the mean as the best case? Should we try and find the one that best matches? That's a good question. But on a site level, should we do that? Because it's literally one pixel, but there's a lot going on there for the models in that one pixel. If we do a more regional comparison, we can see that there's actually, they seem to agree slightly better with each other when you start taking the region as a whole for your comparison. And if we look at the aircraft data from the Arctic-Cap flights, the models do a surprisingly good job. Not all of them. Some of the models do a surprisingly good job simulating what we see in the atmosphere over these time periods. So you've got the observed methane here on the X, the simulated methane on the Y, and we're left with a pretty big spread for the models, but some of them are getting it. The one-to-one line is on the graph. That was kind of my first cut to see if we could do this properly. Now, if we take the dry, now I put dry in quotes here because there's no standing water at the surface, but these soils are saturated. It is the North Slope methane is not predicted by models at all. So this is the Ivatook eddy flux data here. And we're looking at the site to the south that has absolutely no inundation. And we're seeing much higher methane fluxes. All the models are pretty much saying that they're zero. Now there was, Scott Miller did an optimization of the CARV data way back when, and even he sees it as quite a low area. Does that mean it's changed, or we need to be careful on how we're interpreting things? When we look at the graph, where most of the models don't even have the potential to make anything. However, one of them does. Now we have gone into this making a point of not knowing which model was performing well. We wanted to know what are we seeing in aggregate. And our next step is to go back and figure out which one of all these 13 models, one of them works, Which one is it and why? So that's my next task for the summer. Look into all this and why. So the warming, I think, kind of looping back again to the start, climate warming will affect both the synthesis and respiration, but in different ways. So we're seeing that we can often simulate what's going on in the peak of the summer, but in the respiration, we're not even capturing it now. Do we really understand what's going to happen going forward? Things like the North Slope tundra, they're not consistently a net source or a sink. It very much depends on if they get a sunny summer, they're a sink just. If they get a bad summer, they're a source, but only just. How is that going to change as we go forward? And the atmospheric community has been working a lot with the terrestrial carbon community, but not so much with the aquatic. It has given us a very strong bias towards assuming that either light use efficiency models will explain everything, or that wetland methane from a terrestrial side that is not aquatic will explain everything. And that's turning out to be not the case. The atmosphere doesn't care what you give it, it integrates everything. My big question for everyone is, should the wetland methane models be expected to capture all the biogenic methane fluxes? I think, are we asking the wrong questions of them? And before anyone else asks, there is no evidence that the Arctic is driving the recent massive increase in methane that we've seen in the atmosphere this year, which was about 17 ppb. But yeah, so that's everything.
Thanks so much. Are there any questions to kick off the question period?
Or disagreements? Things we've missed out on, suggestions? More than happy to take any and all of the above.
So I'm gonna ask, did I miss, what are the other, when you say that are wetlands the only methane source, what are you suggesting are other sources? You just mean like not surface standing water?
Yeah, what is a wetland?
Right.
Is it wet land? What is wet? How do you decide when something is wet?
Right.
Like there's an entire gradient that goes with that. Wetlands are a protected term in the US, so I think everyone has a bit of a bias.
Okay.
Does it need to be standing water?
Mm-hmm.
Or does it need to be saturated soils?
Right.
Now, from a remote sensing perspective, we can't see saturated soils. They look dry at the top.
Right.
So are they a wetland if they've got really, really wet soils? And so we've been calling it we've been calling them wetland models, but what we really need is a natural biogenic source flux model for methane. And I think if we start thinking about the wording differently, I think we'll end up approaching the question slightly differently. Because if it has to be standing water as a wetland, that is not the only source of methane, not by a long shot. And I'm sure that's true globally. If you can't see the water under a forest, does it mean that the water is there? I mean, if it's waterlogged and producing methane, just because the remote sensing can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I guess that's I'm trying to get everyone talking about it and see if we can figure out how best to do this, because we're missing something. The atmosphere tells us we're missing stuff. Anyone else? I think we're out of time anyway.
Yeah, I think that might be right. Okay, so thank you so much, Roisin.
Thank you. Can I unshare?
Ask Daniel to load up
There we go.
their slides.
All right. How's that?
It's not in presentation mode.
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect. Great.
All right. So I guess I'll get started. Hi, my name is Dan Wesley, and I'm a PhD student at St. Francis Xavier University / Memorial University, and my presentation today is on characterizing methane hotspots in the outer Mckenzie River Delta. So the Mckenzie River Delta is a very interesting area to study environmental sources of methane because it's a prime location for both biogenic and geologic methane emissions to the atmosphere. There's about 49,000 water bodies in the area, which make up about 25 to 50% of the landscape, depending on where you're at. They're most dense sort of in the central delta, and if you go further south, it's maybe closer to 25%. The permafrost is also quite variable. It ranges from less than 80 meters thick to even greater than 400 meters thick. And under that permafrost, there are massive natural gas reserves. So in the outer delta, where most of our study sites were, the permafrost is quite thin, like typically less than 100 meters. Methane emissions in the region are also thought to be hotspot driven. So these hotspots make up the majority of methane emissions. Right, so during this project, our goal was to identify the source of methane at these hotspots. So to do this, we measured atmospheric methane at about a meter above the ground, and then determine the source at each of our study sites by doing Keeling plot regressions of the stable carbon isotope measurements at each site, or the carbon-13 measurements. So this enabled us to measure both the spatial variation at each site and determine the source of the methane at each site. Sorry, the spatial variation of methane at each site and determine the source of methane at each site. So essentially we had two types of sites. We had sites that were identified as methane hotspots during airborne eddy covariance surveys done in 2012 and 2013 in a different study. So these were broad aerial sources of methane that were typically between 1 to 3 kilometers squared in size. So at these sites, we took point samples for isotope analysis, for stable carbon isotope analysis, and also did walking transects to gauge the spatial variation. So these walking transects, we did 2 to 3 at each site, and sampling, they sampled an area of, a transect across the site of about 600 to 800 meters for each walking transect, with a samples typically about a meter apart. So in addition to the eddy covariance sites, we also had, the airborne eddy covariance sites, we also sampled 4 aquatic seep sites. So these sites were areas where either the action of methane bubbling under the water delayed ice formation in the fall, or which is shown here in my slide. But these are areas of methane ebullition here. Or in the case of one site, the methane ebullition was vigorous enough to be seen in open water during the summer. So different than those more aerial sources, these are very distinct point sources of methane. So in the aerial sources, there's more of a possibility to measure multiple sources at the same site, whereas these sites, we know exactly where the source is, and so we know that we're only measuring one source. All right, so we had a broad range of signatures, which ranged biogenic to thermogenic, as well as a few sites that were a mixture of both biogenic and thermogenic. The stable carbon isotope values were between -42 to -78. Between all of these sites, of the aquatic seeps, 2 had very distinct biogenic signatures. They were this one, wetland 1, and bingo 3, this one out here. And 2 were had very distinct thermogenic signatures. Of the eddy covariant sites, we went to 5. 2 had a mixed biogenic thermogenic signature, which were these two Pingo sites here, Pingo 2 and Pingo 1. And 2 were distinctly thermogenic. 1 also, this one here, site 9. It was a very large site, but we didn't measure any elevated methane at that site. I should also note that Pingo 3 was in an area with very different permafrost characteristics. It's much thicker here than over here in the main delta. Right, so there are a couple interesting interpretations from this work. The first is that we had 2 aquatic seep sites, which had signatures matching the QMAC gas field. There's also another aquatic seep site that was measured in 2008 by Bowen et al., which had a very similar signature. All 3 of these sites were within 2 per mil of each other, as well as the signature of the QMAC gas field. So this shows that there's an area of about 20 kilometers north to south that where there are seeps likely coming from the same reservoir. And I've shown us the 3 sites up here in the inside. Another observation to come out of this work is that pingos in the region might also be associated with hotspots of methane emission. 2 of the airborne eddy covariance hotspots were at pingos, and it's known that open system pingos can be a source of methane migration through the permafrost, because they're areas where fluid can migrate from below the permafrost to the surface. So both of our Pingo sites had a very mixed signature, one of which was the same as a signature from a previous study, which took borehole samples in the area and had a signature of about -53 per mil from a borehole sample from below the permafrost. Right, so the significance of this work, it's really the first study to measure stable carbon isotope signatures of atmospheric methane at hotspots in the Mckenzie River Delta. We encountered multiple sources, as you would expect, because it's such a dynamic area for methane production, you might say. The sources range from thermogenic to biogenic, as well as a mixture of biogenic and thermogenic. And there's possible geologic flux from like pervasive geologic flux from thermogenic sources, and possible mixed gas flux associated with pingos, with areas near around pingos. And for future work, we'd hope to do some radiocarbon sampling at some of the sites with biogenic signatures, since there are sort of old carbon sources, like geologic carbon sources that have biogenic signatures in the area, and so to determine the relative contribution of new and old carbon to those hotspots, and to measure, we would also like to measure flux rates at some of these sites. Okay, thank you, and I guess I'll open it to questions.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Does anybody have any questions? So I'm going to ask a question. So Roshin's talked about a missing methane source. Is it thermogenic? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, quite possibly. There's it's quite common in permafrost region where there's like massive seeps of thermogenic methane. Actually, if I go back to this slide here, this seep here, like this is the one that we saw in open water.
Mm-hmm.
These are common. This is a rather large one, but these are common throughout the Mckenzie River Delta. And this has been well known for a long time. And I believe this one, so this one, sort of the furthest north one here in this this map, this is the one that was measured by Bowen et al. And it's, I think, maybe even larger than this one. But you see, they're very close. They're like within a kilometer.
So Roshin asked, or do you want to ask your question, Roshin?
Sure, I was going to ask, do you think these are changing over time as temperatures are getting warmer later? Or do you think they've always been there and we just didn't know to look? And really nice talk, by the way. Great.
Oh, thank you. I know that some of the seeps in the Mckenzie River Delta are have been documented like quite a while ago. They're well known, but I also think that they could be getting becoming higher rate and larger as as the permafrost degrades. There are a high number of through-talics in the permafrost underwater bodies, so these aquatic seeps are quite prevalent, and there's certainly a lot of potential with climate change for them to get larger and become more of a source.
And do you think we could see them in remote sensing if they're causing the ice to break up more often? Like, do you think we could use some sort of satellites to tell us where they might be more?
That's a difficult question. I think certainly the potential is there, but satellite measurements are not very good over water yet. And most of these seeps are aquatic.
Oh, I meant the breakup in ice, but yes, that same point. Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, well, they're certainly very very visible from a helicopter or plane, especially in the fall, because especially if there's snow already on freeze up. But sometimes they don't last very long. Like some of the seeps we measured, like if sorry, wrong way. Like these ones, I know when I went out to look at these, I had a list of about 75 locations of known seeps similar to this. And most of them were frozen over. So you may have kind of a narrow window for the smaller ones for them to actually remain open during the fall.
Cool.
Yeah, but certainly the larger ones, like in that other picture, those might remain open all winter.
So I noticed that it is time for our health break. So there's a 10-minute health break in all these sessions. I guess anybody who wants to keep asking questions to maybe either of our speakers, welcome to stay or discuss other things, but the next talk will start in 15 minutes. Oh, that's right, 10 minutes, sorry. In 10 minutes. So Daniel, I wanted to ask if you can hang around a bit. Do you expect seasonal variation with the thermogenic sources? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that like the seeps are generally like pretty consistent, but some of them are ice covered over the winter, so you can get a big like burst on thaw up, right? And actually, I read a paper recently where they studied a lake over the year, and basically the methane concentrations in the lake got higher and higher through the winter, as you would imagine. And this lake, you know, there was lots of biogenic production in the sediment, but also there are some seeps in the lake as well. So the methane would build during the winter, and the stable carbon isotope signature would become more and more thermogenic sort of through the winter. And then as it opened up, a lot of that methane is released and the signature would become more biogenic through the summer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just time zone challenge. I'm pretty sure that our next talk does not start for another 7 minutes.
Okay.
I have another question for you, Daniel, since you're there.
Yeah.
So something that the atmospheric methane's getting more and more negative. So a lot of the atmospheric community are assuming that there is a massive increase in the microbial driven sources of methane, and very well, it could very well be, but how they calculate that is a bit of a mess. And they're very like, oh, anything that is this number is this. Like they have a very small, a very narrow window of what they assign to biomass burning, to thermogenic, to biogenic. And the numbers you're showing there, like I know that some of it's a mix and it's all this other stuff, but I wonder if there needs to be a better, almost a better, not even a database, but more information given to people outside this community saying these are the kind of numbers we see from something that is quite natural, that it's not like they're assuming that the thermogenic side is all oil and gas and its production and it's leading to this. But I think by not taking the bits and pieces properly, that they might be drawing the wrong conclusions. And I wonder, like, how can we make sure that the knowledge, like these really cool observations, make it into areas that might not be reading the Arctic. You know, we went and checked what the isotopic composition was in the Arctic. You know, how do we get that kind of information to the people who then run with it at 100 miles an hour without checking anything? So is there a way to start getting that communication going more, I guess?
Oh, wow.
Sorry to put all that on you.
That's a question I have no idea how to answer. I don't know, maybe look to other journals, look to journals that have that are not
laughing at me because I ask her the same kind of questions. How do we think bigger picture? And
yeah, although that is a great question. Yeah, I think one way, if you're talking about other scientific communities, certainly I think trying to publish in journals that aren't you know, biogeosciences or the cryosphere or, you know, permafrost and Arctic related journals, more general journals is one way. And publicize your work more on like things like social media, where you can just sort of a non
hit the atmospheric people over the head with the numbers.
Yeah,
it feels like they're not listening. Like you guys, like people are making great measurements and there's a lot of work going on and they're not always listening. And there's been a couple of like Excel spreadsheets put together of numbers that could be there, and then people just like running at 100 miles an hour saying, well, that means that is that. And I wonder how much of the assumptions, how many of the assumptions that they have in there have led to very weird conclusions at the far end when they haven't, like there's no ground truthing of many of the inverse analysis. It's my pet peeve. You can make an atmospheric inversion tell you anything you like, but I don't believe it unless it's consistent with what's on the ground. And do we try and get more of a, this is what we see on the ground, back to them to go, no, what you're saying there can't possibly be true. And I'm wondering if that, yeah, anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
That's a difficult question. It's more to get a
Yeah.
conversation going. If others have thoughts, that would be cool too.
Yeah. I wasn't really aware of a lot of that. Yeah, it's a very tough question to answer because really the biggest problem with Arctic research is the cost and the access and the really being able to ground truth anything, and really being able to extrapolate numbers accurately over,
which is why this kind of work is so valuable. And can we get more value from it again? I guess is kind of what I'm trying to think about more.
Yeah. I mean, I think one solution is to be more collaborative and get the most done during your fieldwork as you can, right? And I mean, be collaborative to people sort of outside of your outside of your subdiscipline as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Just to say.
Maybe also, if you're using these numbers, you should ask the people who generated them what they think their uncertainties are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like chatting with some people that were looking at carbon tracker, methane isotope, and like, are the isotopes consistent with the methane? And the discussion going on, oh, but the number is 45. And I'm like, I've seen those numbers in biogenic. That doesn't, I've seen those in natural ecosystems. That does not mean that you're looking at something that is oil and gas. And I think that disconnect isn't like the natural geologic sleep. Like there seems to be a disconnect within what people are assuming versus what could actually be happening. Does that make sense? There's a lot more going on there, I guess.
Yeah, I have a couple of I would say background atmospheric measurements that were like minus 45 or so, that were actually quite I guess positive, I would say, or towards thermogenic from background atmospheric, and I thought it was quite strange. It's hard to tell whether it's whether there's a large biogenic source there that's just totally getting oxidized and shifting the signature or something, or if it's just background variation.
Yeah.
Okay, I see that there's 1 minute left. Thanks very much for a great discussion. I wanted to put in a public service announcement. So I put together this schedule, and I'm going to say, in an unintended social experiment, all the female all the females who submitted abstracts to the session, myself included, except for our invited speakers, put in for preference for talk or poster, put either, and all the men put talks. So I lobbied to the conference organizers to give us all talks, because I said it wouldn't be fair if only females got posters, but this is a public service announcement to all women who are submitting abstracts to always say talk. So I'm just going to put that there. So our next speaker is Victoria Flood, who will be telling us about her latest work.
Hi, thanks. Okay, so my name is Victoria, and I go to the University of Toronto, and I'm going to be talking about my work using ground-based Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to evaluate modeled concentrations of short-lived climate forces. So a bit of motivation here. Long-term monitoring of the atmosphere can help illustrate trends and changes occurring in the Earth system. And this is important to monitor impacts of anthropogenic emissions and assess links between atmospheric composition, air quality, and climate. Short-lived climate forcers, or SLCFs, can have expedited impacts on the climate. They're also known as short-lived climate pollutants or near-term climate forcers, and they have lifetimes shorter than CO2. And it's important to address these to try and stay on track with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So AMAP, or the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, was established in 1991, and it aims to monitor the pollution and climate change impacting Arctic regions and assess the impacts of these on local ecosystems and human health. And they're also doing this and providing science-based reports for policy and sustainable development. So the red area on the map there is their catchment area, and it's a little outside of the Arctic Circle itself. I just moved my little Zoom thing. Okay. So their latest report was on SLCFs, and it assesses the impact of black carbon, methane, ozone, sulfate aerosols on air quality, health, and climate in the Arctic. And they also included some precursor gases. So what they did is they examined 18 different models, and they all used the same set of anthropogenic emissions. And then they used historical trends and evaluated these to see if the models were good to then simulate future climate health impacts in different emission scenarios. So some major results from this and this part has been released for policymakers already, is that reductions in SLCFs can have short-term climate benefits. SLCF mitigation can help prevent premature deaths from air pollution, and a warming climate will result in an increase of wildfires, which will then further lead to more SLCF emissions and the precursors. So my project objectives here are to use long-term trace gas datasets from NDAC for model measurement comparisons and assess how well the models reflect historical ground truth measurements. So NDAC, or the Network for Detection of Atmospheric Composition Change, has over 70 participating ground-based stations with more than 160 instruments. So the map below here just shows the spots of those instruments. And the primary goals of the network are to establish a high-quality long-term database to study atmospheric change, study the relationship between atmospheric composition, climate, and air quality, and provide a credible source for validation in other experiments, and offer a supplementary data source for other experiments. So the method that I'm using from the NDAC network is the Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. So this measures solar absorption spectra with characteristic absorption lines. And they do this with 6 to 7 narrow band optical filters that are measured in the mid-IR region. And then from here, they're getting atmospheric trace gas concentrations in columns and profiles. So the benefits of using the NDAC ground-based spectroscopy are there's a wide range of species measured. It has high spectral resolution. There's multiple sites, and the data are available publicly. So the sites that I'm using in this study are on this map here. So on the top left, you see Eureka in Nunavut, Canada. Just below that in the brighter green is Thule in Greenland. To the right of that in the turquoise is Ny-Ålesund in Norway. Below that in the blue is Kiruna in Sweden. And then just outside the Arctic Circle there below that in purple is Restua in Norway. So I have models and I have the FTIR measurements. So the models are global, some hemispheric or regional, and they were given on model specific pressure grids of pressure profiles of volume mixing ratios on 3-hour intervals for the years of 2008, 2009, 2014, and 2015, which is going to give me around 3,000 measurements per year. Whereas the FTIR is a point source measurement on a 47-layer pressure grid given in molecules per centimeter squared. And this just occurs at various times during sunlight. So the least amount that I had in 1 year from one location was around about 30, whereas the most could be around 700, just depending on how often the instrument is operating. So my goal here is to align these so that I can compare them. So the setup of this is I started with 11 models. And so those are the years there, and those are the gases CO, CH4, and O3 that I was analyzing. And those are the models. And so I had to turn those into point sources because, as I said, they were given on large grid sets. So I extracted them at the locations of the FTIR. And then I had to match the model times. So those were every 3 hours for those years. And I just had to find the closest FTIR time to that. And then I had to align the model with the FTIR. So to do this, I interpolated the model to the FTIR pressure grid. I made a 0 to 7 kilometer partial column in molecules per centimeter squared. So I chose 0 to 7 because the SLCF report is focused on the troposphere. And then I smoothed the model with the FTIR averaging kernel. And then I was able to plot and compare. So the data that I have, as I mentioned, was on 3-hour output. So there was 11 models that had that was used in the AMAV report. Not every model had all of the gases. So there's only actually 4 that have methane and 9 that have CO. And just to note, the GenMock only has values for 2015 and WRF-Chem only has 2014 and 2015. And the colors here correspond to the colors on the plot that were chosen by or in the AMAP report itself. So for the locations that I have, some of them don't have all the years available. So Nyalsand doesn't have any ozone for 2008, and Hrestia doesn't have any values for 2008 and doesn't have any CO. So I had mentioned in my abstract that the primary location was Eureka. So this is just what I'm going to start with as an example, because it would be a lot of plots to go through all the locations. So this is the first way that I plotted it, just to look at it in a seasonal trend. So up top, we have the columns that I made, the 0 to 7 kilometers, and then all the different colors are all the different models. And it's hard to see, but there's different icons for different years. And the black is the FTIR measurement. And the plot below that shows the percent difference for the different models. So obviously this is kind of a lot to look at all at once. It's good to see if there's a particular year that stands out. So you can see kind of if there's like where the fires are in August, if it's, the model is able to capture that. But as I said, it's a lot to look at. So I also plotted it as a 1-to-1. So this here is methane. So you can see that the methane is doing a pretty good job at consistently under predicting. And this is reflected in the seasonal cycle as well. So although they're not capturing it completely, they're consistently under capturing it. And then, so this is for ozone. So this shows the monthly means across the 4 years. So this way it's just easier to see if there's any spots of the year that are always being over or under predicted. For example, the blue match salsa is always over predicting ozone in the beginning of the year. So moving forward, the same thing of the bottom plot here is the percent differences. So that's what I'm going to be discussing next, but with all the locations. So yeah, I'm doing a cross location analysis here. So I have the percent difference. And so it's model column minus FTIR column over FTIR column times 100. And then that's going to be the mean of that for a year, and then the mean of the 4 years. So starting here, I have the different colors are the different locations, the same colors that were shown on the plot. And from left to right is the most north to the most south relatively. And this is for methane. So the same thing kind of happened with methane across all the different locations. It was under predicting. And then also on the right, those numbers correspond to how many data points I had across the 4 years. So for CO here, we see that GEMOC is the only positive one. But as I said, GEMOC only had the 2015 value, so that could probably contribute to that. And then we can see that there's a bit of variance between how well they're capturing the whole cycle here. And then I have for ozone. So ozone had the largest spread in the 1-to-1, and the seasonal, they had the most variance. So this could be due to the fact that ozone is a secondary pollutant. So that means that the models are going to have more to simulate to be able to get to this point. So Nyalsand is also the turquoise color there. It's kind of standing out. But as I mentioned, we don't have any values for 2008. And that was the one location that had 30 in 1 year. So the overall seasonal cycle isn't greatly captured in this. So I think that that could be contributing to the increase in discrepancy here. So just in a summary, the latest AMAP reports analyzes SLCFs using various models in different future emission scenarios. Mitigation efforts are important to avoid warming and reduce adverse effects. This work assesses the ability of selected models to reproduce the true state of the atmosphere using high latitude ground-based NDAC FTIR measurements for 2008, 2009, 2014, 2015, for CO, methane, and O3. Overall, the modeled partial columns of 0 to 7 kilometers are biased low compared to the corresponding FTIR data, and no single model is outperforming others across the board. So the next steps here are to summarize and evaluate these results compared to the AMAP SLCF report, and then hopefully publish these. So these are just some sponsors and networks that I want to acknowledge here. And then I can take some questions if there is any.
Thanks for a great talk, Victoria. Does anybody have any questions? I might have missed it. Why are the models underestimating ozone?
Right. So they're kind of overall, the models are underestimating like the mean difference. I was just saying that for ozone, because it's a secondary pollutant, that to get there, the models also have to like simulate other things before it. So there's like a lot more kind of compounded.
So you don't think, like, you don't, I'm just trying to think back to the talk from yesterday about GemMock also. Anyways. It's like all jumbled in my head now.
Yeah, long list.
If you mean the fact that we were under predicting in most of the region, yes, I can explain that in terms of, I felt that there was a variety of causes. Our model tended to have an over active deposition rate, and that's why there were several attempts to try and understand and remodel that with a more realistic situation. But there are a host of reasons and why the budget is not quite right.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay, well, if not, thanks very much, Victoria. And I'll invite our next speaker. I'm not sure if I'm going to get your name right, Anais Orsi.
Hello, is everything okay?
Yeah, great.
Very good. So thanks for having me today. I would like to talk to you about all the air trapped in polar ice cap and how that is a storage of air that can help us reconstruct recent trace gas histories for which we don't have direct measurements. So it's a little bit of an advertisement talk for an upcoming project. So I'm sure most of you are not familiar with the Fern layer. So the Fern layer is is what sits at the top of an ice cap. It's before the snow turns into ice. We call it Fern, and these are secondary electron microscope images of, you see the snow grains, and in between the snow grains you have those holes, and those holes are filled with air. And at the very beginning, at the top of the ice sheet, you have channels that connect this air to the surface, and it takes something like 50 to 100 meters for the snow actually to form those bubbles that you see here at the bottom, and for the air to be completely separated from the atmosphere. And the nice thing is that because the fern is layered, at some point you have almost no vertical motion of air, vertical permeability. So the air can get old, but you have a lot of horizontal permeability because the fern is layered. So you can actually suck up, maybe 100 liters of air. That allows you to measure trace gas amount that we might be interested in that are unavailable from ice core measurements. And so the way we do this in the field is that we drill a piece of ice, and then we insert that bladder system it's a big rubber tube. And I showed you here on the right, you have 3 tubes that go into that big, it's made of rubber. And one is we inflate it so that then it's completely impermeable to the atmosphere, to the surface. And then we have 2 tubes that go through that bladder to the bottom, and at that bottom we can suck in the air from the very bottommost layer. And in order to be super clean, we have 2 levels. One that we call the purge, so we just throw that away in case there's some micro leaks from the big drilling hole, and then we just only in our sample take that bottommost part. And so these are examples of profiles that we can measure. You can see here, I'm just going to read through them. Like, top one is CO2, then methane, then SF6, then you have a bunch of CFCs, methylchloroform, and at the bottom C14 of CO2. And what you can see if you look, for instance, at methane, you know that methane is increasing steadily in the atmosphere, and we have kind of a flat line through that white part, and then you go to that gray part that we call the lock-in zone, where suddenly the methane concentration decreases very sharply, and that just tells you that the air is getting older. So the fern itself is quite permeable for that top 60 meters. These are all data taken from one site at Nîmes in North Greenland, where the mean annual temperature is close to -30, and the accumulation is something like 20 centimeters a year. And so you can see that the air stays quite young through that, what we call the diffusive zone. And as soon as the layering makes it such that you have maybe one strong impermeable layer, maybe a wind crust or something like that, that prevents vertical motion of the air, then the air can age. But even though it is impermeable vertically, we can still extract it for something like 10 to 15 meters. And so we have access to that kind of older air. And if I translate that into time, you see here on the left plot, the probability density function of age at 63 meters, which is at the top of that lock-in zone, at the top of the white versus gray area. And so we have air this was taken in 2009, so that's something like 5 to 10 years old. And then if you take our bottommost sample at 78 meters, you have air that's like 60 years old. And so that is how this functions. The plot on the top left shows you as a function of depth the diffusivity, so that you can see how the diffusivity is quite high, and then it decreases very abruptly at that boundary that we call the lock-in zone. And you can see also that at the very bottom, the diffusivity increases again. So that tells you have like a low diffusive layer, so like a more impermeable layer. And below that, you have more permeable air, which is convenient because then we can suck in a lot of that older air. And that very bottommost plot is kind of the same as what you had on the left, which is the age distribution of all the different colors of different models. So don't worry about that. And like shallow versus deeper. And so you can see the age distribution is broadening as you go deeper, but we can recover that older air. And so this is how that Fern Layer sampling works. And I just want to take a couple slides to explain to you what sort of data we can get out of this. And this is an example of reconstructing gaseous elemental mercury at 2 different sites. And so the raw data is actually on the right here. You have 2 sites. One is Summit, so the summit of Greenland, and the other one is Nîmes, that site in Northeast Greenland. And so these here are the profiles as a function of depth of that gaseous elemental mercury. So you can see you have kind of this flat spot where the air is very young, and then you have big gradients that are showing up when the air gets older at the bottom area. And you can see that these two profiles are pretty different. And we can use some of the gases that we know the atmospheric history of to really understand how old the air is. And then from that, we can do an inverse model to reconstruct what should have been the atmospheric history to match that data set. And that's what you see here on the left. And so I just commented on it and in this slide. And you can see, like, first of all, in the 1970s, you have an inconsistency between the 2 sites, and that can be explained by the fact that you have different air masses, contributing to the different sites. And because GEM is not a well-mixed tracer, you can actually see some differences between different sites. And that shows you that it's important to conduct more studies across the Arctic to really understand the concentration and the sources of mercury. And then you can see also that recently, after the year 2000, we have a recent increase again, and that's due to increased emissions in Asia. And this sort of data set also help us better understand, or better quantify the emissions, because the inventory is not always so obvious. And finally, I just want to add a note that sea ice through hydrogen production, influences the conversion of this gaseous elemental mercury to depositable mercury. And so this element is quite important to understand the mercury cycling in the Arctic, and all of that data was published in 2016 in Atmospheric Environment, if you're interested in this study. And this is just an example to show you what sort of data set we can get out of these this Fern Layer data. And so we are going to have a campaign, a Fern Layer campaign at Mueller's ice cap that you can see over here. Hanstausen and Fredensblick are two old ice core sites. And so it's an Excel hybrid garden. This is another view of the same spot. The ice cap is over here. There's a McGill Mars research station there, and Eureka is over on that side of Excel hybrid. And we are interested for this big project to several questions. The first one is, how did sea ice condition change in the Arctic Ocean during the past millennia? And we'll drill that ice core to reconstruct sea ice from multiple proxies in the ice, and have a big oceanography campaign also to understand the dynamics of sea ice variability in that region. We are also interested in climatic conditions. How did they change over the past millennia, and what's the relationship between sea ice change and climate change? And then third would be to understand the glacial history from ice cores. How old is that ice cap? Can we learn about that from the ice core? We also will have some studies of DNA at the base when we retrieve sediments from underneath the ice sheet. And then finally, we'll look at recent contaminants like plastic pollution, and maybe those air measurements that I put that in green, because that's what this part of the project contributes to. And so this is I guess I still have a couple minutes to talk to you about the site selection. This is here, the ice cap, and we're trying to find what would be our base ice core site. So we want small surface velocity. We want high surface elevation to make sure that it's cold enough that we get nice ice sheet. We also want ice thickness to be as big as possible to retrieve both lots of ice and also older ice. And then we want to avoid sliding so that we don't have melt at the base. And so for all this, we found our favorite site here is going to be over here with a surface elevation of 1800 meters, and ice thickness of something like these are like 4 different sort of potential evaluations of that is around 560 meters. And from the Hirham regional climate model, we estimate that the mean annual temperature is maybe something like -22 degrees, and the mass balance, it says 0.5 centimeters a year, but it's most likely more like 0.2 or 0.3. And so that helps us try to like have a first estimate of how thick that Fern layer can be, and how old the air could be. And so that's a simulation that I ran. Tell you that if I take 20 centimeters a year, I get that blue curve, and 30, I get that orange curve. And so this here is a plot of depth in the x-axis and age in the y-axis. So you can see that diffusive zone will have like pretty young ice, and as soon as we get to that lock-in zone, the air ages very rapidly. And so for the higher accumulation, this is all deeper, but the age of the air that we retrieve is pretty similar between the two. It just depends how deep we have to drill to get to it. And so we hope that we can easily get air that's like 40 years old or 50. And we plan to do all the classic measurements of nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and krypton isotope to characterize the site. Then CO2, methane, SF6, and the CFCs too, that we know very well the climate history. And so then we can use that to tune the gas transport model and figure out what the age of the air is. And then finally, we can measure interesting species to reconstruct unknown atmospheric history. And that would be gaseous mercury is one of the target, carbonate sulfide and their isotopes, ethane, and maybe something that you guys might be interested in. So we are very much welcoming interest to reconstruct trace gas that don't have known atmospheric histories for the past 50 some years. And so that's the end of my talk. I just want to summarize that all the air trapped in polar ice caps can help us reconstruct recent trace gas histories. So we will have a Fern Layer campaign in Mueller ice cap probably in spring of 2024. So if any of you is measuring interesting stuff and interested in getting samples, we are very much welcoming collaborations. Thank you.
Thanks for a different type of talk that we're most used to. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, Frederic.
So I'm completely ignorant of that field. Sorry. So how far back in time can you go with your method?
And so in like in the Arctic here, I wrote we could probably go 50 years back. In Antarctica, where we have much older air, we can go 100 years.
Okay. Okay. So you're targeting the latest industrial period.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's still interesting in some with some of the newer type of stuff that we can measure. We often don't have measurements 50 years ago, and so it's still interesting to get that that baseline.
Other questions? Can I ask a basic question? How do you reconstruct the sea ice climatology? I know that's not like the basis of your talk, but
yeah, so it's very difficult. And we have a bunch of different sort of proxies, and we try to use them together to build confidence. And so one of them is just sea salt concentrations. Sea salts are telling you about how far the ice edge is, because they really get emitted when you have the frost flowers. So if there's a lot of sea ice or there's none at all, you get low concentration. But if where the sea ice is forming is where you have a lot of sources. There's also bromine, chlorine, iodine. Those are also sea ice proxies. There are always issues of how well they are preserved in the ice. And another one is a methyl sulfonic acid, MSA, that is also indicative of how far the sea ice edge is from your site. And so by combining different proxies with back trajectory analyses, we can see how these things change in time, but it's very site specific, which proxies are going to be the best ones. And water isotopes can also be useful for that if there are local moisture sources that are there when the sea ice isn't there, and that are not there when the sea ice is there. And so all of that together gives you a picture, but it's not that easy.
It doesn't sound easy, which is why I asked. Does anybody else have questions? Okay, if not, then we'll move to the last talk of the evening, or evening for me, maybe it's afternoon where you are. Erin McGee from University of Toronto. Feel free to share your screen.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin McGee. I'm a student at the University of Toronto, and I'm going to be here to talk to you about validation of short-lived climate forcer modeling by ground-based near-infrared Fourier transform spectroscopy. And if you're having a bit of deja vu from Victoria's presentation, yes, my project does overlap with hers. So just a bit of background to start. The Arctic is, as we know, disproportionately affected by anthropogenic climate change. It's warming at approximately 3 times the rate of the global average, according to the most recent IPCC report. This accelerated warming drives the loss of sea ice, with some models predicting that the Arctic will be free of sea ice for at least part of the year by around 2050. This also decreases the local albedo, further allowing absorption of radiation and increasing heat. Another concern in the Arctic is melting permafrost. As Rasheen mentioned at the top of this session, a large amount of carbon is sequestered in Arctic permafrost, with estimates falling around twice the amount of carbon that's currently in the atmosphere. However, thawed permafrost gains the ability to host much more plant life, which can partially offset the carbon emitted when it thaws, but it's thought that plant growth would be highly unlikely to completely offset the emissions from melting. all of this is just some background to say that the Arctic is a highly sensitive ecosystem that is disproportionately experiencing the effects of anthropogenic climate change on multiple fronts. And these changes feed positive feedback loops. Therefore, being able to model the effects of these various feedback loops on the Arctic atmosphere is really essential for being able to predict future changes to the environment. So the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, or Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, or AMAP, is a working group of the Arctic Council. It consolidates evidence on various factors impacting the Arctic environment and the health of the people who live there in order to inform policy. This infographic shows the main current focus of AMAP. And as you can see, models form a major component of its method. We can also see the current atmospheric constituents that AMAP is focusing on, which are ozone, methane, black carbon, and sulfates. So these species belong to a category known as short-lived climate forcers. These are species that have climate impacts and a lifetime shorter than that of CO2. While CO2 is still the main driver of anthropogenic climate change, the effects of those necessary reductions take a long time to actually show up due to its long atmospheric lifetime, while SLCFs have the advantage of being able to see climate impacts much quicker, hopefully fast enough to protect the sensitive Arctic ecosystem. So AMAP has provided outputs for a suite of models to us. Not all of them include methane, which is one of my species that I'm looking at. But the main goal of this project is to validate the outputs of these models with experimental observations. So for this project, the goal, again, validate the AMAP models describing short-lived climate forces in the high Arctic, compare model differences that may be affecting model performance, and hopefully eventually improve our understanding of the carbon cycle in the high Arctic. So the source for my experimental data to do these validations is the Total Carbon Column Observing Network, or TCON. It's a network of Fourier transform infrared spectrometers focused on the near infrared region, located at 26 different global sites. It has very, very high site-to-site consistency, which is aided by the fact that they use very similar instruments at each site, as well as the use of the same retrieval algorithm. So the data products from the 3 Arctic sites will be used for this work. So that's Eureka, Ny-Ålesund, and Sodankylä. The instrument that's used at almost all TCON stations is the Brooker 125 high resolution spectrometer, which is a Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. It collects solar absorption spectra in the near infrared region. This one is located at PEARL, the Polar Environment Atmospheric Research Lab in Eureka. And very, very similar ones are located at most of the TCON stations. So the near infrared spectra that are collected by this instrument, because the one at Eureka is also used for mid-infrared measurements. The near infrared spectra are analyzed with the GGG-GFIT algorithm, for which a new version, GGG 2020, was recently released. Some sites are still undergoing quality control procedures. So for this presentation, the GGG 2014 data release is used for the Sodankylä. And for Arctic sites, measurements are taken during the sunlit portion of the year, which is mid-February to mid-October in Eureka and Ny-Ålesund, and for a slightly larger portion of the year in Sodankylä, which is a little bit further south. So my focus will be on methane and carbon monoxide for a very simple reason. They're the only species that are of interest to AMAP's models that have corresponding TCON data products. In terms of their significance as SLCFs, methane contributes to Arctic warming, and it is 28 to 36 times as potent as carbon dioxide over a 100-year time frame, but it has a warming potential of about 84 times that of carbon dioxide during a 20-year time frame. Carbon monoxide is primarily of interest due to its effects as a precursor to ozone, which in the troposphere acts as a pollutant that is harmful to both plant and animal health. So the product from these models is given as vertical profiles with volume mixing ratios provided at different pressure levels. to compare this to the TCON data products, which are column average dry air mole fractions, or X gas. A pressure weighting function was used. This method has been used previously in other work to compare model outputs from geochem to TCON data. The equation is given here, where pressures are, PI is pressure at the level indicated, and surface is the surface pressure, and UI is the volume mixing ratio of the gas in question in the profile. So having computed those, here we see the monthly means of XCO, which is the X gas of carbon monoxide, calculated from the model profile and retrieved from the TCON stations. Just a quick note, these are relatively preliminary because smoothing has not been done using the TCON averaging kernels. This is in progress, but the results are preliminary for that reason. So in these plots, it becomes clear why it's so essential to have good models for the Arctic in particular. Due to polar night, solar measurements at high Arctic sites can only be done for a portion of the year, as you can see, especially with the Allison here, which only has results for April through September. At least for the years that I was looking at. These are for 2014 and 2015. AMAP also provided data for 2008 and 2009, but since TCON was established in 2010, though Nelson and Sedancula did exist, there's a general lack of data before 2009. So I will be focusing solely on 2014 and 2015. So with these monthly averages, we can see that while some models seem to align fairly well for portions of the year and for certain sites, there's no one model that particularly stands out as both showing both the magnitude and the relative seasonal trends that are observed. Though if I had to choose one, match appears to be doing pretty well, which is this dark green one. When it comes to methane, it's a bit of a different story. So not all of the AMAP models model methane, but here we can see those that do generally don't perform as well with methane as they do with carbon monoxide, with geochem appearing to do slightly better than CMEM, and CMEM doing much better than EMEP MSCW, though monthly means don't tell the whole story. Here we see the full time series for 2014-2015 for all the models. The plots that are stacked above each other show the same site with different models that are separated for legibility. And here we see the percent differences for XCO to gain a better understanding of how these models are performing. These are the percent differences between TCON measurements and the closest temporal model prediction. Nothing in here is particularly unusual, except perhaps EMEP MSCW, which does not seem to perform well in Eureka and Sedancula in particular, though most of the rest of the models are performing roughly the same, though most seem to underestimate carbon monoxide. Match is a slight outlier in it performs slightly better than the rest. So here we see the time series for methane. And with this, we see that while geochem may, on average, slightly better agree with the FTIR retrievals than CMEM does, we can also see that CMEM shows approximately the same trends in variability as well as seasonal cycle. And this is somewhat borne out in the percent difference calculations, which are on this slide here. So here we see, though, it may have an offset and some amount of noise. CMEM percent differences are relatively consistent in time, while EMEP MSCW shows a distinct trend, and geochem might show some, but it's hard to tell. And more work, of course, is required to really quantify these models' performance, which involves a lot of other stuff and may include averaging across sub-monthly scales. So sorry for breezing through the end of that, because I know I'm pretty much at time. So these preliminary results, they appear to be somewhat consistent with other validations of AMAP models, including a publication that is in review currently. no one model clearly outperforms the others, especially since there's still work to be done to further refine the model X-gas calculation, which is the next step of my future work, which is refining the model X-gas calculation to make sure that the comparisons are valid, including smoothing with T-con averaging kernels. We're also going to add more models to comparisons and compare model differences in design that may be driving differences in performance, with the goal of ultimately improving our understanding of the Arctic carbon cycle. And at that point, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Erin, for keeping that enthusiasm up. Anybody have questions for Erin? Can I ask a hopeful, well, it's not a quick question, but I don't know anything about, I know very little about, I should say, very little about all of these models. Are there like, I guess, major differences? I mean, we've heard today about like how we don't understand what's coming out of the surface. Do you have any sense at all of the models that you're dealing with? Like, are they dealing with thermogenic emissions? What are they doing with wetlands? Like,
in terms of like specifically which emissions, I don't know off the top of my head. I do have a supplementary slide with some of the more detailed differences right here, because there are a lot of models and I know that I will forget which is which. So if there's something that you're looking at in particular,
I mean, I just
have that here.
Curious if like, you could give a sense of like, what are the models generally including, considering all the talks we heard earlier today, earlier in this session, especially.
Yeah. So off the top of my head, I have immediately forgotten everything that I've learned about them, because that's how it goes. But yeah, I did breathe through it, but
I can maybe help a bit. I know,
yeah,
just
go
because
for
obviously
it.
we're using the same models.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, so there's like ones that will, like most of them don't actually model like the stratosphere, but the actual AMAP SLCF report found that like that didn't necessarily like help or hurt them. And then they all use the same anthropogenic emissions, but then each model kind of treats like the rest of everything else, like the depositions and everything different.
Yeah.
One thing
also,
that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it also varies model to model what they're focusing on. Like, for example, CESM is an Earth system model, and most of the rest of them are chemical transport or chemistry climate models. Although MRI ESM2, which I haven't plotted on my plots here because the results I got from my pressure weighting function were very, very off. So I'm holding back on that until I make sure that I've done that correctly. Yeah.
One thing to like again to a non-expert, that when that table you just showed us previous to that jumped out immediately to me was how CMAM did reasonably well. He said when you showed around, yet for quite the first two columns of processes, biogenic and one other, it didn't even have it in the model. And maybe sometimes that's the problem, is that having something in your model poorly is better than having it in there.
Yeah. And I haven't gotten to the point where I'm really looking into comparing why models are performing the way that they are yet. But if it doesn't have any biogenic emissions, yeah, it could be a case of that isn't what's driving variability, because as we saw, there was an offset to it, so it could be that there's a contribution from those sources, but it's fairly consistent, at least at these sites, and that could be driving the offset, but potentially just not much variability.
There's a comment in the chat from Anan. If you're interested in,
oh, awesome! Yes,
video.
I'm definitely interested in that.
Any other questions or comments? So if not, then I'd like to thank everybody for contributing abstracts, coming to listen. and staying until the end of the session. It was really great session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of CMOS. And thanks to Bob and William for helping to co-convene this session.
Yeah,
And
thank
thanks for
you.
convening, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Okay, bye.
Okay, have a good weekend, everybody. See you Monday.
Thanks, Rachel.